Hi, I'm Jeff Riccardi, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. After doing more than 40 episodes of Security Breach, perhaps the only topic that solicits a uniform response is when my guests are asked about the most important part of a cybersecurity plan. The common mantra is that there has to be buy-in throughout the organization for any plan to be successful, and it starts at the top. Obtaining C-level support is obviously vital when it comes to loosening the corporate purse strings for investments in software, penetration testing, and training resources. But beyond that, corporate leadership can set the overall tone for a company's attitude towards cybersecurity and the threat it presents throughout the organization, not just for IT or OT personnel. An encouraging report from Rackspace Technology points to cybersecurity being a leading concern of manufacturing C-Suite, with 65% citing it as a top 3 concern. That's ahead of inflation, the skills gap, and supply chain pressures. This should serve as encouraging news to this episode's guest. Before we talk to our guest for this episode, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Rockwell Automation. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to rockwellautomation.com. It's now my pleasure to welcome Frank Riccardi, author of Mobilizing the C-Suite, Waging War Against Cyberattacks, to Security Breach. He's a 25-year veteran of developing data compliance and privacy guidelines. Frank, thanks so much for joining us today. Maybe just to get the ball rolling a little bit, you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you sort of got into the cybersecurity game.
Sure. Well, Jeff, thanks for having me. I appreciate being on your podcast. And I've got 25 years experience in healthcare compliance, working for large healthcare systems that owned hospitals, physician practices, and health plans. And my job as Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer, and in other roles, was to implement compliance and privacy programs. And healthcare has a big target on its back for cyber attacks. So I've been embroiled for many, many years in investigating data breaches and cyber attacks, and over the years developed a deep expertise in cybersecurity. And I wrote a book, Mobilizing the C-Suite, Waging War Against Cyberattacks. And I wrote the book because I wanted to galvanize C-suite leaders into embracing a greater degree of oversight and accountability for cybersecurity than they have in the past.
Yeah. You say you have a background in healthcare. Before anybody discounts the applications there, as our audience is in the industrial sector, financial and healthcare were the big two. Manufacturing sort of overtaking that. So a lot of the lessons learned there are definitely going to apply to things that we see on the manufacturing side. As you alluded to Frank, the book talks about the C-suite and its role in cybersecurity planning and processes. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how that's shifted. It seems like there's been a big change across the board in cybersecurity, sort of pre-pandemic to now. Bring that in and how that's affected the C-suite's perspective on cyber.
Prior to the pandemic, most C-suite leaders and the board of directors were worried about cybersecurity, but they really didn't appreciate that role. Or maybe they didn't want to, but post-pandemic, it's a whole new world. So what happened in the pandemic in 2021, the pandemic was raging across the planet, and so was ransomware. And there were 3 big cyber attacks that happened, and these cyber attacks created an environment where ransomware now became a household word. So it wasn't just a cybersecurity thing, but now everybody knows about it. So first you had Schreiber Foods, and they were a big dairy conglomerate in Wisconsin. They got hit by a cyber attack, and that cyber attack was a proximate cause of the great cream cheese shortage of 2021. But then you had JBS Foods, which was this big Brazilian meatpacking giant. They had a cyber attack, shut down their systems, and it affected the meat food chain. Then you had the granddaddy of them all. You had Colonial Pipeline, and a cyber attack caused the pipeline to shut down, and there were fuel shortages for nearly a week along the East Coast. So Jeff, what happens is, for the first time, you have the general public, you have media and law enforcement looking at cyber attacks in a new way. Prior to the pandemic and prior to those 3 cyber attacks, people thought that cyber attacks were synonymous with data breaches. And cyber attacks are something that happens in cyberspace. But now they're starting to see, oh my gosh, ransomware affects us in the real world. I can't get a schmear on my bagel. I can't get a ham and turkey sandwich, and I can't load up my gas tank in my SUV. And so now what's happening is the public, media, and law enforcement, they're angry at the cyber criminals, But if it's because of a cybersecurity lapse that the breach happened, they're really getting mad at the executives. And a good example of it is, I'll bring up Colonial Pipeline again. So Colonial Pipeline, they were attacked by a cybercriminal gang called DarkSide. You're probably familiar with DarkSide. And DarkSide found this old defunct VPN account of an employee that no longer worked for Colonial Pipeline. And nobody knows how they stole the password. They think that employee probably reused the password for another online account. There was a breach there. DarkSide stole the password, and they stuffed it into the VPN account of Colonial Pipeline. And lo and behold, it worked. And they got into the system. They were in there for weeks on end. Nobody knew about it. They stole 100 gigabytes of data, and then they injected ransomware into the system. So there are all these congressional hearings, and the public learns that one of the issues were Colonial Pipeline, they didn't have a cybersecurity control, which everybody has. An employee leaves the company, you terminate their access to systems. So if they would have closed that old defunct VPN, the cyber attack would have been thwarted. On top of that, if that VPN account would have been protected by multi-factor authentication, well, DarkSide had the stolen reused password, but they wouldn't have had the one-time numeric code. Cyber attack thwarted. So what happens is the public, law enforcement, media, they make this connection and they say, well, wait a minute, we're really mad at the cyber criminals, but if the reason the cyber attack happened was because there was a cybersecurity lapse, you didn't close your accounts, you didn't use multi-factor authentication, maybe you weren't installing patches, whatever, the public is now just as angry at the C-suite as they are at the cyber criminals. And now the C-suite's seeing the heat, feeling the heat. The board of directors is feeling the heat. Some C-suite leaders have lost their jobs over cybersecurity breaches. And now finally, post-pandemic, the connection is being made where C-suite leaders are starting to finally realize, okay, I have more oversight authority. I have accountability and liability. I have to take this a lot more seriously than just being worried about it like I was in the past.
Yeah. So are you seeing a transition from them delegating this and assuming, hey, the IT guys or the operational technology folks, they're taking care of this, I don't need to worry about it? Are they getting more involved in, I guess, what you would call maybe the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity?
I wrote the book Mobilizing the C-Suite because I don't think they're getting involved to the degree that I'd like to see them get involved. It's not enough to hire the best CISO on the planet and have a great cybersecurity team. They have to provide effective oversight, and it means that they have to understand the basics of cyber hygiene. They have to understand the threat vectors. They have to understand what it means to have an effective compliance program so that they can ask the tough, hard questions of the CISO and also the board of trustees or the board of directors, so they can have the tough, hard questions, but also so that they can support the CISO, make sure that the department is the right size, not a bare bones cybersecurity program. So I think there has been a sea change. I think it's a little bit all over the map in terms of companies fully supporting CISOs and companies fully taking on accountability, which is one of the reasons why the Security and Exchange Commission has been exercising their rulemaking authority to force executives at publicly traded companies to be more accountable. So I think it's a lot better after the pandemic than it was before the pandemic. So I think it's a lot better, but I still think there's a ways to go.
Excellent. In the manufacturing sector, we talk a lot about digital transformation, which is a great positive in terms of creating operational efficiencies, but it also opens up a lot of gaps potentially for cybersecurity. Are you seeing the C-level individuals in a manufacturing or an industrial setting getting more involved in saying, hey, look, we need to have cybersecurity as part of our digital transformation strategy, or is it still being pushed down the line a little bit?
Digital transformation, by its very nature, raises cybersecurity risk. It's just the nature of the beast. And it doesn't mean you don't do it, because you'll get left in the dust if you don't do it. You have to do it, but you proceed with caution. And there's two reasons why I think digital transformation is hard. One reason is throughout the entire process, very often, you're going to have a misalignment between the CISO and the cybersecurity team and the management. And it's going to be the age-old battle of user or customer convenience versus cybersecurity. And a lot of times, consumer or customer convenience will win. And the example I'll give is this. I have hundreds and hundreds of online accounts, and you probably do as well. And many people have to use a password manager. They have so many. And it's because a lot of organizations, they're getting rid of their manual processes, they're getting rid of their expensive overhead, and they're moving everything to online portals. So for example, a hospital medical records department, they will move online so that patients can go online and get their medical records anytime they want. A bank has a financial services portal, so you can make financial transactions and trade stocks. Walmart and big box retailers want to be like Amazon, so they've got a portal for payments. And I look at all of the online portals that I have, hundreds of them. A third of them are not protected by multi-factor authentication. I may not want it, but I can't have it because they don't offer it. Now, the vast majority of them do offer it, but it's optional. So if I'm an unsophisticated user and I don't know about it, I won't do it, or if I don't want the hassle. Now, about maybe a handful of my accounts, the minority, the organizations that I have a portal with, financial services and some medical record account, they make me do MFA. They say, you want to come into the database, fine, thou shalt do MFA. Now, Jeff, you think about this a minute. When you're going into an online portal or you're doing anything with the internet, one of the biggest risks is credential stuffing and brute force attacks. And multi-factor authentication is the premier countermeasure for credential stuffing attacks and phishing attacks. And yet, in some cases, I can't have it. In some cases, it's optional. And in a few cases, they make me do it. Well, why is that? It's because they're having conversations with their teams. And in some cases, cybersecurity is winning. And in some cases, it's more user convenience. Now, if you look at that conversation, just a simple MFA online account, but throughout the entire digital transformation process, that battle is being waged and those conversations are happening. And so that's why I think it's all over the map and it can be difficult.
You know, Frank, I want to touch on a couple of different topics you mentioned in the book, which I can't recommend enough. It's a very quick read, a lot of great information. But one of the things you called phishing cybercriminals' favorite pastime. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about why do phishing schemes continue to be so popular? Why do they continue to be so effective when in reality they seem real simple to negate?
So what has happened is a lot of cyber attacks now have become democratized. And what I mean by that is this. Used to be, let's say X number of years ago, in order to launch a cyber attack, you had to be a geek. You had to understand what you're doing. You had to be tech savvy. You had to know all this stuff. Now you don't have to be a geek. Somebody can give you a bad USB and you just have to have the moxie to walk in a company and stick it in a computer port. You don't have to be smart. You don't have to know cybersecurity. And the same thing is true about phishing. Phishing attacks are easy to launch. You just have to launch it to 10,000 employees. And out of 10,000 employees, I could have the best cybersecurity program on the planet, but I only need one person to click on the link. One person out of 10,000 and I win. And so it's the law of large numbers. A CISO or an organization spending all this money to defending against cyber attacks, they got to win every single time. The cyber criminal only needs to win once. So that's one of the reasons why I think phishing is happening. And phishing is always going to be popular. It's cheap. It's easy. You don't have to have any experience to do it. You just have to have the moxie to do it. You think about people are worried about deep fakes and voice cloning and all of that. Phishing is so much easier to do. If I was a cyber criminal, I'd rather get a bad USB and stick it in a computer port. I'd rather do a phishing attack than try to monkey around with voice cloning.
Yeah, one of the themes we can constantly hear about is hackers would much rather log in than break in. So if they can get any of this information from any multiple avenues, that's the route they prefer to go. Another topic that you mentioned a lot in the book is warning against the reuse of passwords. So, and that's kind of interesting because a lot of times we'll develop good passwords, they're secure passwords, they're not that complex, but they're not too simple. But then we do reuse them over and over again. Maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the potential negative elements of that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Here's the interesting thing, Jeff. 25 years ago, when I was getting in the business, I went to a presentation. It was a cybersecurity expert and said, don't worry about the making the strong password. Make it as strong as you want. Make it 10 characters, symbols this way, but just use it for everything. Just use the same password for everything, and then you never have to remember a password. But back in the day, people didn't realize, okay, but what if I use that password all the time and there's a cyber attack? And now what's going to happen is cyber criminals are going to take that password and they're just going to spray it to all these online accounts. So my one reused password, I could have the strongest password on the planet, but if somebody gets it and I'm using this password for my Bank of America account, my medical record account, I'm using the same password, all they have to do once they steal it, or there could be a breach and cyber criminals sell it on the dark web to other cyber criminals. And so what happens is once you get a reused password, that's probably how DarkSide got into Colonial Pipeline. And it's one of the easiest things to do. Just get a password and try it with everything. And it's one of the things organizations really have to focus on. It's not just trying to get employees to use a strong password, but making sure they use different passwords, that they don't use the same password everywhere. Because if you do that, the only thing that's going to save you is MFA. That's it. And if you're not using MFA, they'll just plug your password into an employee account or a medical record account. And if there's no MFA, they just go in and they've got you. So reused passwords are absolutely one of the worst things. And a lot of big organizations, Colonial Pipeline potentially, Dunkin' Donuts was a victim of credential stuffing attacks because their customers were reusing their passwords, and it was a really big cyber attack. And it's one of the simplest things that companies can prevent. They can offer MFA. There's things that they can do to monitor their systems to make sure if there's something funky going on that they can alert their customers. And again, if there's a breach because of a credential stuffing attack and the organization didn't enable MFA, didn't give it to their customers, the public is going to be mad at the cyber criminals, but they'll be just as mad at the company.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about walking that line and the role of the C-suite in terms of getting people behind these policies and practices, but when somebody makes a mistake, maybe not burying them initially either, and also appreciating that this is an individual who wasn't trying to allow the hackers in, but made some mistakes.
Yeah, good question, Jeff. And one of the big points in my book is that C-suite leaders, they need to be cognizant of cyber hygiene and what it is. And they need to be cognizant of all the various threat vectors and how cyber criminals access their network. And they don't have to be geeks or anything like that or cybersecurity geniuses, but they at least have to understand the basics, because what they have to be able to do is they've got to walk the walk and talk the talk. And if the C-suite, if they're not going to use MFA, if they're not going to take the phishing training, if they're not going to use strong passwords, if they're not going to exhibit cyber hygiene and be role models, if they're not going to support the CISO, nobody else is going to do it as well. And employees will pick up on it. They watch leaders, they watch executives, and they will model that behavior. So C-suite leaders and the board of trustees, they just really need to show that they're supporting the CISO and that they're supporting the cybersecurity team. But also, when the CISO says we need to do this initiative or we need to do this education, that the C-suite is doing it as well. Everything that they're asking of the employees, they've got to do the exact same thing. They got to walk the walk and talk the talk.
Absolutely. I was really interested in the book. You mentioned it and you referenced it before, the cream cheese shortage of 2021. It's interesting because when that was talked about in news cycles, the ransomware attack was not referenced. It was more about supply chain disruption and things like that. And what that led me to think about is something I've talked about in this podcast a lot, is greater transparency, especially within the industrial sector. You mentioned a couple of them with JBS and Colonial and Schreier here with this bakery. What are your thoughts there? How can we do a better job of sharing some of this information, not being so afraid to share information for fearing the fallout, so that we can develop some better practices, whether it's for a certain type of attack or even a certain type of attacker?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Jeff, when we cover up cyber attacks and data breaches and sweep them under the rug, we are helping cybercrime. We are helping cyber criminals. And if you want to reduce cybercrime, you really need to shine a light on it and get it out there. And we definitely need to have some type of an international, or certainly in the United States, some kind of a data repository that all of these cyber attacks are getting reported to. And how we go about doing that, the devil's in the details. But the beautiful thing of a central repository, it's useful for CISOs in the industry. They could look at this repository or this database, see what kind of cyber attacks are happening in their industry, and it would help them maybe change the focus of their cybersecurity program to defend against these attacks. It would help law enforcement hopefully catch some of these people, because they're so hard to catch, especially when they're on the other side of the world. But the thing I'm most excited about is if we had some kind of a database, an international database of cyber attacks and data breaches. I'd like to give it access to cybersecurity researchers, because cybersecurity researchers, they could do experiments on the data, they could do research on the data, and they might find all of these cyber attacks that are out in the wild that we don't even know about and can't defend against because we don't know they're out there. And if cybersecurity researchers can find them and call them out, then we can start defending against them. So I think transparency is very important. I know people are worried about public relations and liability, but we're all in this together. And I'll tell you, Jeff, it's just getting worse. Cyber attacks are getting worse. You have, again, nation state threat actors that are putting unlimited resources behind affiliated cyber gangs. We really have to work together. It may be embarrassing and you may worry about liability, but we really need to get the data out there so people can see it and use it and help us defend against these attacks.
Well, I would think the biggest benefit potentially is just the lessons learned in terms of being able to publish that information and say, hey, look, we were open. This was the vulnerability they exploited. Here's how we did respond, or we didn't know how to respond. And being able to share that information, you think, would make everybody more secure, helping with a lot of these embedded or security by design type policies and practices. So hopefully we can continue the momentum that's been started here.
I hope so.
Another great topic you brought up in the book, you called it IT-OT convergence, and sort of bringing some of those roles together. I think in the industrial sector, we're still really struggling with that. It's more about, we got IT in a silo over here and OT in a silo over here, and they don't really talk to each other, even though they have to start. So I'd be interested in hearing your take in terms of what you've seen in other industries and sort of bringing them together for cybersecurity, and maybe what some of the key practices could be in helping those two work together better.
Yeah, to me, it's almost like digital transformation. You have to bring them together, or you're going to get left in the dust. And the way technology is happening, they are going to be brought together eventually. I just look at the Internet of Things and smart homes and all of that, and it's really difficult. I don't know how you do it without. I don't know how you come up with a really good cybersecurity platform or cybersecurity strategy unless you get all the big technology firms getting together to try to figure this out as well. And I don't know how you get Apple and Microsoft and Google to all get together and play in the same sandbox and bring in the government. Because here's the problem, Jeff. Again, I'm looking at the small rural hospital. They can't fix this. I'm looking at a small automobile dealership. They can't fix this. You look at an industry that's trying to pull things together. And again, it's hard to do it on your own when you've got competing technologies, you've got competing information systems, you've got competing platforms, and you've got multiple different vendors competing with each other. I think it's a real risk. I think IT and OT is a real risk, and I don't know how we ultimately get there without a public-private partnership, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So it's going to be companies trying to do the best they can, working with their CISOs and cybersecurity teams to do risk assessments, constant risk assessments, and try to address the biggest risks they have with the resources they have on hand.
Yeah. I think what it's going to take is the public sector really coming to the private sector and saying, look, we don't care about your data. We don't care about your network. We don't care about any of that stuff. We just want to help you be more secure, and here's the tools and resources to do so. And the private sector being able to accept that and not worried about Big Brother sort of coming in and stepping on toes.
Yeah, not worrying about regulations or blame. I mean, how do you do this in an environment where the company's not going to be blamed? But yeah, I would agree that is, we have to have a public-private partnership.
Good. Got to ask you, you mentioned it throughout the book. You mentioned it a lot here in our conversation. Ransomware. It's a huge topic, continues to escalate and grow. Part of the reason being a lot of people pay the ransom. What's your take? If you're in that situation, what is your overall advice? Do you pay the ransom or not?
Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to make sure, are you legally allowed to pay the ransom? Because the Department of Treasury, they have a division called the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and there's a database called the Specially Designated Nationals. And it's like a list. If cyber criminals end up on this list, you've got drug dealers and terrorists. But if you've got cyber criminals on this list, and one of those cyber criminals are the ones that have attacked you, you may not be legally allowed to pay the ransomware. Or if you do, you need to talk to your cyber liability carrier and your legal counsel, because there could be fines and penalties against you. So you need to work with your cyber carrier and your legal counsel just to make sure you're not running afoul of any regulations before you pay the ransomware. But Jeff, here's the thing. In the main, I'm kind of against paying the ransomware as well. I'm definitely against paying ransomware as a default strategy, because here's what happens. Very often companies will pay the ransom, and what ends up happening is the cyber criminals just go away. And so they've paid the ransom, but they don't unencrypt the network. Or what will happen is they'll pay the ransom to the cyber criminals, and the cyber criminals, they're human, they make mistakes. They don't have the right decryption key, and they can't unencrypt it. And so you've paid the ransom, but you still got the ransomware, and so it didn't do you any good. And it's better to focus on paying the money up front with a good cybersecurity program, good information systems, training your workforce on cyber hygiene, getting a good cybersecurity team and a good CISO. You can pay up front or you can pay on the backside, but you're rather off paying up front and putting your money in that regard. But I will tell you why it's tricky. Sometimes I think you're stuck paying the ransom, and let me tell you why. So here's where I wouldn't pay the ransom. Let's say, and I'll use an example of a hospital, but it could be any organization. Let's say a cyber criminal group gets into the hospital network and steals data on 100,000 patients. And they say, well, pay us ransom or we're going to post the patient data on the dark web. Well, I wouldn't pay the ransomware. I wouldn't pay the ransom because they got the data. They're going to do it anyway. They're cyber criminals. They're bad guys. And if they don't post it on the dark web, they're going to use it somehow. So once the data is gone, it's gone. I don't think you should pay the ransom. I think it's just a wasted money. On the other hand, what happens if you're a small physician practice, and let's say you're a dermatology practice, and you experience a cyber attack, and your medical record is locked with ransomware, so it's all encrypted, and let's say it's the data of 400,000 patients, and you can't get that data no matter what you do. You've done everything, and you didn't back it up for whatever reason, so you can't get it. Well, now you've got a quality of care problem because you've got people that may have melanoma, that may have all sorts of conditions that they don't know what their drug histories are. They don't know what any of their histories are. They might not even remember all the patients that they need to bring in. So you have patients that need medical care that may not be able to get it. If you can't get access to the data and it's going to affect people's health, well, maybe you should pay the ransom. And I'll tell you, we always see ransomware cases where the cyber criminals ask for $1 million in Bitcoin. I've seen them ask for $3,000 in Bitcoin. So if they're asking for $3,000 in Bitcoin, and why not take a chance that the decryption key will open up your network and you can get your 400,000 patients back? So in some cases, I can see why you should pay the ransomware, why you'd want to think about it. In some cases, I would say definitely you can't do it. In some cases, there might be legal issues with doing it. But I think in the main, really, the best thing to do is put your money up front in a really good cybersecurity program.
Yeah. The best defense is a good offense. That's as the saying goes. And it's interesting, you used the example of a physician's office, but the same thing applies to small food manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers, medical device manufacturers, or even somebody who isn't involved in something maybe that day-to-day that seems that serious, but still has a real big effect up and down the supply chain in terms of people's jobs, retail outlets, things like that. So good point in terms of how difficult that ransomware dynamic can be and why there is so much pressure to pay, even though we probably shouldn't.
Yeah, and the other thing is when you do pay, like I said, the public, the media, and law enforcement, they blame you just as bad as the cyber criminals, and it's just a bad optic to pay ransomware.
Yeah. Well, the thought is that you're just funding the next attack, essentially. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, Frank, before we let you go, one last question here. As you kind of look ahead a little bit, maybe the next year and a half, any big trends you're seeing that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think, Jeff, one of the biggest trend is going to be accounting for the human factor in cybersecurity programs. So, and I'll give you an example. So typically CISOs, when they're implementing and refining their cybersecurity programs, they look at it from a risk perspective. They need to start looking at it from a human factor perspective. And I'll give you an example. So many organizations, when they're telling employees, you need to create a strong password, okay? And it's got to have letters, and it's got to have numbers, and it's got to have special characters. Cybersecurity researchers are finding out that employees really struggle with special characters. And when you force them to make a special character with, when you force them to make a strong password with special character, they end up making a shorter, weaker password. And cyber criminals, they know this. They know that people are going to, just put an exclamation point at the end of their password just to get it through the system. And so their password cracking technologies account for the human factor. And so a lot of cybersecurity researchers are saying, well, maybe you don't want to do a special character if it's tripping up your workforce and ending up with actually a weaker password. Maybe you want a long passphrase that employees can remember more easily. Or maybe you want to invest in a password manager and make it available to the workforce to help them with all these complex passwords. So I think CISOs will need to look at their practices and see where they can make them more, employee friendly. The other thing is if you can embed the human factor in your training. And one of the ways to do that is with teachable moments. So, if you have training that can show examples of things that can really happen and be a problem, like, if you have workers or employees and they're traveling with their laptop, don't put it in your car where it can be stolen in a smash and grab, put it in your trunk. And oh, by the way, we encrypt that laptop for you. Please don't scribble down your password on a sticky note and put it on the laptop, because that bypasses our encryption. Don't do that. Another teachable moment is explaining to the workforce about bad USBs and USB drop attacks, and just let them know, when you come to work, if you see a strange USB on the floor, you find a device, don't stick it in your computer port. You might be injecting ransomware into the system. Please call cybersecurity. Another thing that I think we can do with the human factor is more showing and less telling. And an example of that is a lot of organizations provide phishing training, and they will explain to employees, you get a strange email, don't click on the link, you're going to inject ransomware into the network. Well, don't just tell them, show them. You can buy anti-phishing software and you can phish your own employees. And you can try to trick and hack your workforce, but when they click on the link, instead of getting a nasty ransomware payload, they're getting education. And so, anti-phishing education. So if you can show, not just tell, but show people, I think that helps get the human factor across. And I think if you can use teachable moments, I think that helps account for the human factor in training.
No, great thoughts. Really appreciate it, Frank. The book, again, Mobilizing the C-Suite, Waging War Against Cyberattacks. Frank, where can our folks get a hold of that?
Amazon. I mean, you can get a hold of it at any bookstore, any book selling platform, but the easiest way to do is Amazon.
Thanks for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Frank Riccardi, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.